So this is the second time I'm filming this because the first time I'd just cut my fringe and it looked so bad I literally can't bear to watch that footage again. So I'm doing it again. Okay, hi, hello. This video is going to be a review of The Power of the Dog by Thomas Savage, which you might know recently got made into a film by Jane Campion. It's on Netflix. It's got like Benedict Cumberbatch in it and everyone loves it. It's a really good film. I love it a lot as well. But I guess this is going to be primarily a book review. I refer to the film sometimes because I think they're quite similar and they're both very good. But yeah, ever since the first trailer for The Power of the Dog came out, I just got so excited for the film. I don't think I've ever been so excited for a film. And so I went out and about a month ago I bought this book to read. I don't think you can really find this version anymore. Now if you want to buy this book to read, the only version you can find on like Amazon or wherever is the horrible Netflixified version of the cover, like a picture of the main character from their eyes downwards, and it's got that horrible Netflix sticker that isn't a sticker, that like covers that like you can't take off, and it's just so horrible. But this looks a bit like the Windows screensaver. It's vintage, so it's got the lovely red spine. So The Power of the Dog is set in Montana on a ranch in a sort of like ranching valley, and it's about two brothers, Phil and George Burbank, and they're like polar opposites. Phil is this tall, brilliant, well-read guy. He can play chess, he can play the banjo. Everyone like sort of gravitates towards him. Whereas George is this sort of stocky, silent, good businessman, practical kind of guy. Phil is also this horrible, vicious guy. He's like so sadistic, he just loves getting a rise out of them. Whereas George is like a more gentle, loving guy. And they've lived in this sort of uneasy equilibrium for about 20 years, just all their lives on this ranch, until one day George unexpectedly marries a young widow from a nearby town called Rose. And she comes to live with them at the ranch, and Phil begins this unrelenting campaign to psychologically tear her down. He really hates her. But what he doesn't realize is that there's someone else, Rose's son Peter, also playing a game with him, and this will ultimately lead to his downfall. I don't want to go too into detail because I don't want to spoil the book too much, so I'll leave out the specific details about a lot of things, but in case I think I'm getting a bit too spoilery, I will say in the description. So on the blurb to this book it says, "From visceral start to electrifying end, the power of the dog will hold you in its grip." And so it's not really a spoiler to say that there is a really like bombshell ending to this book. It happens very quickly, sort of. You don't really see it coming. Like just as the book sort of starts to drag a tiny little bit, it's all of a sudden it's the ending. But just because it happens quickly doesn't mean to say it's rushed. It's just one of those endings where the seeds of it are like sown throughout the book, and once you look back you can kind of see it. But for me personally, I did not realize what had happened until the very last line, and that's just part of what makes it such a great book. But what really elevates it to another level, I think, is this sort of penultimate twist right before the ultimate ending. It's kind of just not really a twist, it's sort of a revelation where a lot of things start to make a bit more sense and you're like, oh. In the sort of description of the film, I think it says something like, "Secrets come to light." And I feel like you might be able to tell a bit more with the film, but so Phil has like this secret basically, and I think that secret is what really elevates this book in my eyes to make it really memorable. Again, I don't want to give too much away, but this edition of the book has an afterword by Annie Proulx, and Annie Proulx, if you know, is the author of Brokeback Mountain, if that gives you any sort of idea about what the revelation is just before the end of this book. It's all about that repression and how it manifests. That's a very similar theme that Brokeback Mountain and this book has. That and like, I don't know, cowboys. So let's talk a bit more about the book. One of the really big themes in this book is like isolation. The ranch is set in the middle of nowhere, and that's paralleled by how isolated all these characters feel. Phil, even though he is quite charismatic and he has like a really close bond and camaraderie with all the ranch hands, that's like his one redeeming feature. Because of his secret, he is just permanently isolated away from the world. Rose, she and her former husband came to the nearby town from somewhere else, and they've always been sort of poor outsiders. And that only gets kind of worse when she marries George and she gets this massive bump in social status, and she moves out to the ranch in the middle of the nowhere. You know, now she's got like a maid and a cook, and so she's got nothing to do all day. Rose's son Peter is sort of an outsider as well. He's very clearly stated to be different from like regular kids ever since he was just a little boy, and that's kind of one of the reasons Phil hates him so much. It's because he's a sissy. He doesn't call his mum like mother, he calls her Rose by first name, and he's just always done that. Even George, which I didn't pick up so much in the novel, but watching the film, George is really isolated as well. You know, he's spent 20 years, no, just all his life living in his brother's shadow, being sort of browbeaten and picked on. He's just been so lonely for so long. Now let's talk about two of the characters in particular, Phil and Peter. Phil is just such a complex character. You really hate him throughout the book just because of how horrible he is. But then I found by the ending, I felt really sorry for him. Like, he's this horrible guy. He's racist, sexist, anti-Semitic. But I feel such sorrow for him at the end of this book. Because, you know, talk about that secret and that revelation. You kind of see why he's like this. It doesn't justify it, but you can see how he sort of could never have been anything different. Okay, so slightly more spoilers now, but the way that Phil's secret is sort of hinted at, and the way like I picked it up, is there's this guy that he keeps bringing up called Bronco Henry, and Bronco Henry was the guy who taught Phil how to ride and do all the ranching stuff like 20 plus years ago, and he just keeps bringing up Bronco Henry, just reminiscing about the old days. In the film, it's a bit more explicit, like he has a sort of shrine to him in the bar. He's got like his old saddle, and you begin to realise like this Phil guy is a guy who hates everyone, but he talks about Bronco Henry with such reverence, and you realise that Bronco Henry has such a grip over Phil's cold, icy heart that perhaps no one can ever replicate, because Bronco Henry actually died 20 years ago, right in front of Phil's eyes. And once you learn that, near the end of the book, where there's this sort of 2-page rush of emotion from Phil, you sort of realise that Phil is like really emotionally stunted. Phil kind of stopped growing when he was 20 years old, after he saw Bronco Henry die. And what makes the ending of this book so sad is that something happens with Peter that cracks open that shell. He's opening himself up to the possibility of like feeling like regular human emotions again, and then immediately it's like snatched away from him. It's sort of like cheated of him, and so even though he's such a horrible guy, you feel so sad for him at the end. The character of Peter is like my favourite in the book, from what you don't see as well as what you do see, because a lot of his plan is hidden till the very end. Phil and Peter are kind of polar opposites in the sense that Phil really hates who he is and is like trying to cover it up, whereas Peter like couldn't give less of a fuck about what people thought of him. He's always known he's peculiar, and he sort of owns it. There's this really good scene where Peter walks past Phil and all the ranch hands, and they're all like whistling and jeering at him and calling him sissy, and he just pays them no attention. And Phil notes in his head that Peter could very easily go back to the house in a different way. He doesn't have to face the ranch hands, but he doesn't even think about that. He just walks straight back the way he came, and this time everyone is silent. You know, he's so unabashedly himself, and that's something Phil kind of hates and also admires. But like, even though Phil repeatedly calls him a sissy, personally, by the end of this book, you realise that there's nothing soft about Peter at all. Like, he has just absolute, like, single-minded focus and conviction to his goal, which is ensuring his mother's happiness. There's this bit in the film, I don't know if it's actually in the book, where Peter's talking about his father who killed himself and how one of the last things he said to him was, "Peter, I'm worried you're too strong." And Phil obviously is like, "Huh, you strong? You got that wrong." Because, you know, obviously Peter isn't like very physically strong, but you look back through the book and, like I said, there's nothing soft about Peter at all. It's hinted at in little bits. Brings this really cute rabbit to his mother and she's like cooing over it, and then later you find out that he's killed it and dissected it on his table. And finally, you know, in this moment that he's like striking his like final blow, Phil is so vulnerable and he just like looks him in the eye and does it anyway. You feel it a bit more intensely in the film because, you know, when Phil wakes up all sweaty and sick, his first thought is like, oh, where's Peter? And he like gets the rope that they've been making and sort of is like trailing it out and looking for Peter, and Peter just doesn't show up, and so off he drives to town and he never comes back, obviously. So yeah, by the end of this book you're really like looking Peter, like you're really like side-eyeing Peter, like you're really just shocked at how cold he is. So yeah, those are my thoughts. I'm not very good at book reviews, but I'm trying to get better. Let me know if I can improve in any way. I wholeheartedly recommend this book. I'd give it about an 8.5 and 9 out of 10, honestly. It's a really good length. It's not too long. It doesn't drag at all. There aren't like really boring bits. So yeah, if you like the film, definitely read this. If you haven't seen the film yet, I would read it before you see the film. It reminds me a lot of John Steinbeck, in particular of Mice and Men, just with similar sort of vibes, themes of like isolation and loneliness and sort of lost hopes and dreams set in a sort of ranch area. You get what I mean? So if you like John Steinbeck, I think you might like this. So yeah, let me know what your thoughts are on this book and like some recommendations of books like it that maybe I could read. Okay, yes, goodbye.